Appreciate it. Hi guys, how you doing? All right, my audio good? Okay. Give me a second to gather my thoughts here. Here they are. All right, so I'll start with a joke. Tom Woods swears he never said this to me, but he did. He said, start with a joke. So, what's the difference between Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George Bush, Bill Clinton, George Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden? The Waco Massacre is also an acceptable answer. All right, that's enough of that. Waco jokes, man, Waco jokes. All right, so listen, I'm going to try very hard to do the very quick bullet point version of this talk, which is always the kiss of death and never works. But I'm going to try very hard to do that because I want to talk about the Middle East, but I want to also talk about America's policy in Europe and in Asia too, and see if I can kind of cram all that in. So the bottom line up front is that what I'm about to explain essentially is that American foreign policy has provoked our problems in the Middle East, in Europe, and in Asia. And the Americans say that everything they do is in defense of themselves or other innocents or the liberal rules-based world order and all of that. But the case that I'm about to make for you is that instead America, more often than not, is the aggressor in all three of these situations. So we start back in the Cold War. And, you know, this is when I was just a kid. Some of y'all are a little older than me. I was just a toddler when Jimmy Carter was the president. Actually, one of my first memories is Ronald Reagan's inauguration. That's how old I am. But so, in 1979, in Jimmy Carter's presidency was a very tumultuous year. A lot happened. First and foremost, his government, well, actually, first of all, I guess I'll start with the Iranian Revolution because that was at the beginning of the year. The CIA and State Department had encouraged Jimmy Carter to encourage the French to go ahead and let the Ayatollah Khomeini come back and inherit the revolution in Iran because he's a friend of ours. He helped us overthrow the government last time in 1953, so we can get along with him. And a lot of people, when they think back on the Iranian Revolution, they just think of the hostage crisis. But that was actually 10 months after the revolution, in November of '79. The original revolution was in February, and the Americans got along with the Ayatollah all year long. They were passing him intelligence, warning him about Soviet intentions and Iraqi intentions, as Saddam Hussein had just done a bloody coup and overthrown the government to become dictator of Iraq that same year. The hostage crisis broke out in November. Anyway, that same year also, the Carter administration started backing the Mujahideen resistance against the communists in Afghanistan. And they did this, as they said at the time, in order to try to provoke the Soviets into invading Afghanistan. Now, the policy during the Cold War was containment of the Soviet Union. But what the problem was Vietnam. It had been a disaster, and the American people had what the government called Vietnam Syndrome, which is like a mental illness that people didn't want to send any more of their sons to go fight in any more Koreas or Vietnams to contain communism. So what they said was, you know what, if Vietnam was that bad for us, maybe we'll turn our policy upside down. Instead of containing communism, we'll bait them into overexpansion. We don't want them to move into West Germany, but how about Afghanistan? Those people are expendable. So the policy was deliberately to give the Soviets their own Vietnam in Afghanistan by luring them in there. Now, American support for the Mujahideen is not really the reason that the Soviets invaded. They had their own reasons. Essentially, their sock puppet government couldn't hold it together and they needed to replace it and put down the insurrection. But that's why they were doing it, and so the point stands. Now, after the hostage crisis in Iran, Jimmy Carter was embarrassed. And he had an election coming up, and he had to do something. So in his State of the Union address in 1980, he announced the Carter Doctrine, which was essentially a war guarantee to the Ayatollah that he now hates, saying to the Soviet Union that they better not invade Iran and try to dominate the Persian Gulf. The Persian Gulf is an American lake, and we'll treat any attempt by any other power, read the Soviet Union, to dominate the Persian Gulf as an attack on the United States itself. And as part of that Carter doctrine, they started building up bases in the region, and explicitly Carter gave the green light to Saddam Hussein to invade Iran and promised to back Saddam's war against Iran. Now, picture a very detailed map of the Middle East in your head. I know you've got one. And wonder why Saddam Hussein was so intent on invading Iran. What does he care if there's a revolution next door? Well, the answer was he was sitting on a minority Sunni dictatorship dominating the supermajority Shiite Arab population of his country. Now, in Iran next door, it was a Shiite fundamentalist revolution that had come to power. So Saddam was afraid that the Shiite population of his country was going to choose their religious sect and side with the Iranians next door over choosing their national sect as Iraqis and their ethnic sect as Arabs. So Saddam's solution to that problem was to conscript them all and send them to war against Iran instead. And in fact, some Iraqis did side with Iran and fled to Iran and took their side in the war. Okay, so Jimmy Carter's gone, Ronald Reagan comes in, and he continues these exact policies. Now he's back in the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and that includes not just local Pashtuns, but it includes the International Islamic Brigades, which was Muslims from all over the world, especially Arabs, but including Americans and Chechens and Indonesians and Filipinos and God knows who, all went to go and fight the holy jihad against the godless communists in the war in Afghanistan. Okay? And Reagan also continued to back Saddam Hussein's war against Iran throughout the 1980s. He's probably more famous for selling missiles to Iran because he was playing a double game. That's the Iran-Contra scandal. But all in all, America was really on Iraq's side in that war, while our allies, the Israelis, were backing the Iranians. That's how that goes. But anyway, so I'm going somewhere with this. At the end of the Iran-Iraq war, Saddam Hussein is flat broke. And he can't rebuild his country because oil's trading at about $10 a barrel. And he's deep in debt to the Kuwaitis, the Saudis, and the UAE princelings there. And the Kuwaitis especially are being jerks about it, and they're calling in their debts. And Saddam Hussein starts massing his troops. And on July 25th, 1990, the American ambassador, April Glaspie, goes to visit Saddam Hussein. And you can read the Iraqis' version of this in the New York Times, and now finally, thanks to Julian Assange, we can read the Americans' version of the same cable that describes the meeting, where the Americans essentially gave Saddam Hussein a flashing yellow light to invade Kuwait. Now, they didn't tell him to take the whole country. They were basically giving him permission to take the northern oil fields. And in fact, Ambassador Glaspie later told the New York Times, well, we didn't think he was going to take the whole country. Oops, well, he did. So then, and the Americans didn't really care for the first few days. They said, well, we'll figure it out. He better not roll on to Saudi Arabia. But then it was the British that freaked out, Margaret Thatcher. And the British were the ones who had, you know, severe investments in debts with Kuwait, not the Americans. But once Margaret Thatcher called Bush Sr. a wimp, she said, don't you go wobbly on me now, Bush. Then he had no choice but to throw down the gauntlet. And they decided for the rest of the year 1990 they would not negotiate in good faith to prevent the war. Once they started the build-up, it was guaranteed they were going to war. Now everybody thinks of Iraq War I, that is the Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm, as short and sweet and easy, space-age American technology versus an old Soviet-built military. And the American forces did defeat the Iraqi ground divisions and no problem, their armored divisions, no problem. But the war wasn't really all that simple and easy. That's deceptive. Because at the end of the war, George Bush encouraged the Shiite supermajority of Iraq, as well as the Kurds up in the north, who are Sunnis but Kurds, a different ethnicity. He encouraged them to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein. Some of you guys might remember the movie, although this is probably outdated now, but there's a movie with Marky Mark and Ice Cube and George Clooney called Three Kings, where it's a gold heist, and they're soldiers, and the setting takes place after Iraq War I, in the aftermath of the war, during the Shiite uprising, is going on in the background of the movie. Anyway, this is important because George Bush encouraged them, got on the radio, dropped leaflets, and got on the radio personally and encouraged them to rise up and overthrow Saddam. And essentially promising that we would help, or at least, you know, hold back, prevent Saddam from crushing them. But then they changed their mind, and they let Saddam Hussein keep enough helicopters and tanks to crush the insurrection. Upwards of 100,000 Shiites and Kurds were killed. Why did he do that? He did that because they realized, remember now, Bush had been Reagan's vice president. This is Reagan's third term, essentially, the same team of people. Well, they realized they had just spent 8 years, 10 years almost, supporting Saddam Hussein to contain the Iranian Shiite revolution. Now they were importing it into Iraq. And in fact, Iraqis who had chosen Iran's side in the Iran-Iraq war were now coming across the border to lead the revolution. So Bush Sr., Dick Cheney, Brent Scowcroft, James Baker, they choked. And they stabbed the Shiites in the back, and they let Saddam kill them like the Bay of Pigs. Okay? So this is an absolute catastrophe. But then it became the excuse to stay in Saudi Arabia. Now, it's not like Saddam was going to kill every last Shiite. He'd finished putting down the insurrection, but that didn't matter. This is what they sold to the Saudi king. This is why we have to stay in our air bases, to patrol the no-fly zones, to protect the Shiites and the Kurds from Saddam Hussein. Now, in the aftermath of the war, about a year later, Dick Cheney was the Secretary of Defense, and under him were some prominent neoconservatives who nobody knew their names then, but you know them now. Paul Wolfowitz, Scooter Libby, Zalmay Khalilzad. And these are the guys who wrote what was called the Defense Planning Guidance for 1994. Sounds boring, but this was the doctrine of the American world empire in the aftermath of the Cold War. Hey, Willie, how's it going? In the aftermath of the Cold War with the Soviet Union and their collapse. It's going to get louder in a second. It's kind of a nice little ditty, you know. That's his sister playing piano. Well, I'll just check my notes to make sure I didn't miss anything. Yeah. Okay, so this is what's called the Wolfowitz Doctrine, this defense planning guidance. And they wrote two versions of it because the first one leaked to the New York Times and it said, we'll do whatever we want by ourselves. And they said, no, 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 that upsets the Democrats. We'll do whatever we want with the help of our allies. Oh, okay, now it's multilateral. But what they're really saying in there was that America will be the dominant political and military force on the planet Earth permanently forever. There will be no new rise of Japan or Germany or of the former Soviet Union or of China. And no regional power or group of powers will be allowed to challenge American military supremacy, or we will kill them first if they try it. America will be the dominant force in the Middle East. America will be the dominant force in Europe. America will be the dominant force in Asia. And this is how we keep world peace, is holding the whole thing down with the American world empire. That's the Wolfowitz Doctrine. But then they got thrown out because people were sick of the Republicans for a while, so they brought in the same damn difference, Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton came in, and at first he wanted, in fact, he made a mistake. He wanted to make friends with Saddam and bring Saddam in from the cold, but he said so out loud. Oops. And so all the enemies of that policy went into full effect. One of the first things they did was they made up a lie that I bet people in this room still believe to this day, because you never heard anybody tell you straight, that Saddam Hussein tried to kill George H.W. Bush with a truck bomb in Kuwait in the spring of 1993. Total hoax. And Seymour Hersh, the great reporter, debunked it in the New Yorker magazine. It was nothing but a whiskey smuggling ring that they embellished into this plot. And guess what? The same guy who had been the ambassador to the United States, whose daughter claimed that she had seen Iraqi soldiers throw Kuwaiti babies on the cold floor to die and steal their incubators, was the same guy who spun the plot against Bush Sr. in 1993. And it was on the basis of that lie that the Israelis were able to force through their favored policy, which they called dual containment. Because America had just beaten the crap out of Iraq so badly in Iraq War I, the Israelis thought, Iraq is no longer powerful enough to balance against Iran. Even though they'd helped support that war, oops. So now America has to stay in Saudi to balance against Iraq and Iran both. That's dual containment. And that means that those no-fly zones and the sanctions and the Cold War against Iraq and Iran will not be allowed to be brought to an end through any peaceful negotiation through the entire end of the 20th century, through the rest of Bill Clinton's presidency. And this is the most important driving factor in turning the Arab-Afghan army, the International Islamic Brigade terrorists from the 1980s war, into Al-Qaeda, the anti-American terrorist group that attacked the United States all through the 1990s and culminating in September 11th. And now, well, it's hard to figure out which order to tell this in. First of all, there are other motives, okay? The primary motives are the bases in Saudi being used to bomb Iraq, support for Israel in their occupations of Lebanon and Palestine, support for the dictatorships in the region, and pressure on them to keep the oil price artificially low. You know how every election year they go, we're telling the Saudis, ramp up production. That means subsidize our economy at your poor people's expense. That's what that means, and that's the way they took it. And also supposedly turning a blind eye to Russia, China, and India, and Uzbekistan and their wars against Muslims, which is hilarious because in fact Bill Clinton backed the Al-Qaeda terrorists in Kosovo, in Bosnia, Kosovo, and in Chechnya, in all three cases at the Russians' expense. In the first two, their allies, the Serbs, in the Bosnia and Kosovo wars, and then in Chechnya directly against the Russians. And they did this throughout the 1990s, despite the fact that Al-Qaeda was attacking us. And I know that people think that if Bill Clinton's backing Al-Qaeda in Chechnya, that means he controls every single thing that they do, but I don't think it really works like that. I think the Democrats, and we have statements to this effect, they thought that they were bribing these guys, that they were buying them off. That, hey, look, we're your friends, we're helping you in Bosnia, we're helping you in Chechnya, when in fact, they were still backing the kings of the Middle East. They were still bombing Iraq. They were still supporting Israel. And they were still doing all the things that were driving these men to attack us on September, well, throughout the 90s and September 11th. And they did. They attacked. The first major attack was in 1990. They assassinated this radical Israeli rabbi in New York City named Rabbi Kahane from the, I believe, the Koch party. Then in 1992, they tried to kill some Americans at a Radisson in Aden, Yemen. In 1993, they, of course, bombed the World Trade Center and almost succeeded in knocking one tower over into the other at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, 4:30 in the afternoon, which could have killed 10 or 20,000 people. That was when Bill Clinton had just been in power for a month and a week. But what happened was they raided the Branch Davidians 2 days later, and so everybody forgot about it. Maybe for the better, I don't know. But then they bombed the, they attacked and killed Americans training the Saudi National Guard in '95. They attacked American airmen sleeping in their barracks. Who? American airmen whose job it was to bomb Iraq, sleeping in their barracks in Khobar in Saudi Arabia, which Bill Clinton and Louis Freeh, the director of the FBI, blamed on, get this, Iranian-backed Saudi Hezbollah, because there's some tiny faction of Shiites in Saudi Arabia who happen to live on top of where all the oil is, that the Saudi monarch hates. So they decided to blame the attack on them, when it was bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed who did it. And by depriving the people of the United States of the truth, of the reason that our airmen had been bombed there, we just didn't even have that discussion at all. It was Iran did it from across the Gulf for no reason, but they just hate freedom or whatever it was. Instead of, there are people, you know, right-wing religious wackos in Saudi Arabia who are willing to stop at nothing to get our combat forces off of their soil. And that conversation wasn't had because they lied. And then, of course, was the Africa embassy bombings, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, Nairobi, Kenya in the summer of '98, and then the USS Cole in the year 2000. where hundreds were killed in the embassy attacks, and I believe it was 17 sailors were killed in the Cole attack. And this whole time, America's still backing them anyway. Now, as far as September 11th, I don't know how people in this room feel about it. I personally am not a 9/11 truther. I predicted it, and I kind of thought that Al-Qaeda was a CIA project all along, but I don't believe that anymore. And I think that, you know, basically it's a lot more complicated than that. That the Saudis, the Brits, and the Americans like to play a double game, and they think they're smart, but they're really not that smart. And that the Al-Qaeda guys really had their own motive to do what they did. And so if you guys want to argue about that, we can do that in the Q&A at the end. But that's my take on September 11th. I'm a Ron Paul guy. It's blowback. It's revenge for supporting the bloody sins of the Saudi monarchy, the U.S. Air Force, and the Israeli Likud party especially. And that's what happens. So again, it's a provocation. It's not a justification, but it's just to say that the one thing was the motive for the other. Now, motive is one thing, but strategy is something else. And this is something I cover in the books, and I try to show with as many sources as I can, and there's plenty, that bin Laden's plan was not to make America run away screaming and crying and go hide. He wasn't stupid. His son gave an interview with Rolling Stone magazine in 2010, where he said, when George Bush was elected, this is Omar bin Laden, his non-terrorist son. He was in Afghanistan in the summer of '01, and he said, when Bush was elected, my father was so happy. He said, this is the kind of president that he needs, one that he can enrage, who will come and break the bank, and he will replicate the same thing that he did to the Russians, to the United States. And so he said, when America was more restrained under Bill Clinton, that was very smart. Not like the bull that runs after the red scarf. So that was the whole point of terrorism, to create the reaction, the overreaction. How could a group of 400 bandits hope to destroy a superpower? Well, you got to give our government an excuse to destroy us. And that was the goal, and that was what they succeeded in doing. Now, I'm not going to do all of Bush and Obama's wars and everything, because the rest is history, right? You all lived through it and you all know it. Some of you fought in these wars. But Bush refused to negotiate with the Taliban. Instead, he falsely blamed them for the attack, and instead of negotiating over Al-Qaeda. So we went to war in Afghanistan, fought there for 20 years, giant surge, lost anyway. Iraq War II, killed 1 million people. What did Bush do in Iraq War II? He picked up right where his father left off, and he brought the Shiites all the way to Baghdad, fought a 5-year civil war for the other side, for the Iranian Shiite side in the Middle East that the Americans hate so bad. Then, you know, from there, Libya, Syria, Yemen, in those three, we took Al-Qaeda's side. We're back on the side of the guys who attacked us, under the guise of fighting the war on terrorism, ultimately because the Israelis hate the Shiites more. And so then, you know, the war on terrorism is not really over. We still have Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. In Yemen, we're probably going to be at war with them for the rest of our lives. But isn't it funny how it just seems like it's all over, the Middle East wars? Yeah. We went from radical Islam means that every Muslim is trying to kill you and your mama and your little sister, and they're completely implacable enemies. They're completely irrational enemies. There's nothing we can do but wage aggressive wars to keep them on their heel from now on. David Petraeus said this is going to go on for generations, because Islam makes men into psychopathic terrorist murderers. And then they went, nah, you know what, forget that. It's COVID now. It's Russiagate now, and now it's COVID, and now it's Ukraine, and next it'll be Taiwan. But what about 1.5 billion screaming Muslims who are all trying to kill us? Oh, that was a lie all along, see? It was just a small group of outlaws, and it wasn't their religion that motivated them at all. It was radical politics. Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan had made them warriors. George Bush and Bill Clinton had turned them against us. That's all. Okay, now how bad am I on time? Let's talk about Europe. The Wolfowitz Doctrine says, forget the Middle East, the name of the game is America must be the dominant force in Europe forever, because if we're not, it could be the Germans, and we don't want that. The purpose of NATO, according to British Lord Ishay, is to keep the Russians out Wait, the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out. So, at the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was falling apart, George H.W. Bush promised them that we would not take advantage and we would not move our military alliance east into the former Warsaw Pact states, or heaven forfend, the former Soviet so-called republics. And not only that, but they lied to Gorbachev and then to Yeltsin and said that what we're going to do is we're going to make NATO a political organization. It'll kind of be like the EU plus America. But we're going to replace it as a military security organization with a new project called the Partnership for Peace. And Russia, you can join. It's going to be fine. But they were lying. And they were just telling the Russians what they knew the Russians needed to hear to get the hell out of our way. And once they're out of our way, then we can do what we want. When Bill Clinton came in, he pretty much picked up the exact same policy. One, planning and working on the project quietly in the background of how to expand the NATO alliance, while at the same time lying right to the Russians' faces and telling them, we're not doing NATO, we're doing the Partnership for Peace, you guys are going to be in on it and it's all going to be fine. What difference does it make? Well, what difference does it make is whether we have a common security system for Europe, or whether America's military alliance is a knife pointed at the Russians' throat. Whether we're now, at the end of the old Cold War, now re-dividing Europe, only moving the line further east and creating, again, an enemy out of the Russians, and unnecessarily so. And so that was it. Now, Bill Clinton also, of course, had the wars in Bosnia and in Kosovo. Bosnia is less clear-cut, but we definitely had no business there, and certainly made matters worse with our intervention. And Bill Clinton, of course, had to lie to justify intervening in the way that he did. But even worse was the war in Kosovo in 1999. Where they just outright lied and pretended that 100,000 Kosovar Albanians had been slaughtered, civilians had been slaughtered in a genocide, and we had to go and stop it. It was an outright lie. It was like Saddam Hussein's nuclear weapons program. Never happened, never existed. When the war was over, finally, they found a total of 3,000 bodies, all fighting age males, and maybe some small part of them, lined up and shot, murdered, but almost all of them were just fought and killed in battle in that war. They just lied to justify it.
Yeah, but that really skinny guy on Time magazine cover.
No. And then, where the hell am I? Oh, and I mentioned Chechnya again. This is part of the great game. We're talking, if we looked at a map and I show you Georgia and Chechnya and Ingushetia and all these areas in the Caucasus Mountains, in the land between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, you might wonder what the hell we're talking about or why this matters. When we talk about Georgia, we have to call it former Soviet Georgia, because Americans otherwise wouldn't even know what the hell you're talking about. What's Georgia? Georgia's between South Carolina and Florida. And in fact, when there was a war in Georgia in 2008, which George W. Bush started, of course, there were Americans who got terrified. What do you mean the Russians are sending troops into Georgia? And we're really afraid because they didn't know. And they certainly wouldn't be able to understand if you told them that the American government has decided that former Soviet Georgia is the heart of the American empire. There's nothing more important than who controls the southern Caucasus Mountains, because who controls the pipeline routes out of the Caspian Basin? Are we going to let all that oil and gas go through Russia? Or are we going to make sure that it all goes east and west through Turkey or through Uzbekistan or wherever it has to go to keep it out of the hands of the Russians? And so that was why they backed a bunch of bin Ladenite head chopper, suicide bomber, murderer terrorists in Chechnya. Was to keep the Russians off balance so they can't reopen that pipeline, that old Soviet pipeline they got running through there. That was all. They commit any treason to keep a pipeline from opening up, 6,000 miles east of here. And of course, they expanded NATO. And they expanded NATO in 1999. They brought in Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. And then 3 days later, after expanding their defensive alliance, they launched a war, the war in Kosovo. Just 3 weeks after the final ceremony expanding NATO, in violation of George Bush's promise to the Russians. And they were warned. So Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger and some of the worst hawks in America, they supported NATO expansion in the 1990s. But some of the worst hawks actually opposed it too. George Kennan, who had invented the containment policy in the 40s, and his rival, the hawk Paul Nitze, who had supported not containment but Soviet rollback, they both were agreed we shouldn't be doing this. Robert McNamara, who had been the Secretary of Defense during the war in Vietnam, and in fact was a self-confessed war criminal from World War II, Korea and Vietnam, as well as Bill Clinton's sitting Secretary of Defense, William Perry, who almost resigned over it. And William Perry later blamed himself for, quote, the entire deterioration of American-Russian relations after that time. He said, I could have called one-on-one meetings with Strobe Talbot and Tony Lake, the guys who were pushing the policy. He said, I could have written up a big essay and I could have demanded a one-on-one meeting with Bill Clinton. And I could have threatened to resign. And he said, I didn't do it. And I always regret that. And he says, there are some people who will say it's not my fault, but I don't accept that. It was. I could have prevented this and I didn't. And everything bad that's gone wrong between America and Russia since then is because of my decision to refute, his cowardice in not going so far as to threaten to resign over it. That was what William Perry said. And by the way, William Perry, he wasn't some Democrat political hack. He was a civilian egghead from the Pentagon who'd just been promoted up through the ranks kind of guy, a nonpartisan nuclear bomb expert type. And so why do they do this? If all these, not just, centrist or liberal types, but if the right-wing hawks even opposed it, then why do they do it? And the answer is corruption and money. There's a guy named Bruce Jackson, who was an executive vice president from Lockheed Martin Marietta. I know you guys could have finished that sentence for me, right? Was he going to say Northrop Grumman or is he going to say Raytheon? He was an executive from Lockheed Martin Marietta. And he was the founder of what was called the Committee for NATO Expansion, which is just the committee for getting rid of fighter bombers. That's all it was. How to get American taxpayers to buy more planes to get rid of, to sell to Eastern European partners. And they hired the neoconservatives. Andrew Coburn says, to truly understand the neoconservative movement, they are a cross between the Israel lobby and the military-industrial complex. The bankers and the oil men, they already had the Council on Foreign Relations. But the arms manufacturers, the new right, they didn't really have any eggheads to write up their studies to be excuses for getting rid of their crap. So they hired the Israeli lobby to do it. And that's what we call the neocons. Richard Pearl and Paul Wolfowitz and Scooter Libby and Stephen Hadley and all these guys. That's who they represent. The Likud Party and Lockheed. And so these were the guys who did it. And the same guy, by the way, Bruce Jackson, was the same guy who founded the Committee for the Liberation of Iraq, which was all just about payoffs to get people to support the upcoming Iraq War II at the time. Now, Bill Clinton did promise the Russians that, you know what, we are going to expand NATO and there's nothing you can do to stop that. But tell you what, though, we'll have this thing called the Founding Act, where we promise we won't put any of our military equipment in the new Eastern European NATO countries. And we'll create the NATO-Russia Council so you can be a part of it. But no, we're not making any promises. We won't sign a treaty, but we promise. And I got the quote coming up in the new book. I found it, and it's from his friends that quote him saying it, where Bill Clinton says, yeah, and then we promise not to move our military equipment into Eastern Europe until we wake up one morning and decide that that's what we want to do after all. which is, of course, exactly what they did, and which is probably exactly what you would expect Bill Clinton to say and to mean. That's when he's speaking with his friends, you know. All right, so W. Bush comes in, and he, first of all, launches a massive NATO expansion, 9 new countries into NATO in 2004, including the Baltic states, right on Russia's border. Now, I know you guys have very detailed maps of Far Eastern Europe in your head, so I want you to think very hard about this tiny little strip of land called Kaliningrad. See, I said I was going to do bullet points and skip the details. There's this little strip of land called Kaliningrad on the Baltic Sea between Poland and Lithuania. And it's a Russian naval base on the Baltic Sea there. But it's landlocked away from Russia by Belarus and Lithuania. They only have access by way of a railway corridor there. Well, Pat Buchanan, the paleo-conservative anti-war guy in the post-Cold War era, he said, we should not be doing this. Look at this folly. By adding Lithuania to NATO, from the Russian point of view, we have now left Kaliningrad stranded behind NATO lines. This could cause a war right here. And we saw at the outbreak of the war last year that in the name of EU sanctions, the Lithuanians actually tried to prevent the Russians from shipping concrete and steel on that railway to Kaliningrad. And that's how World War II started, was Hitler demanding his corridor to Danzig, you know, and the Poles shutting him off. And this is the kind of thing that could very quickly lead to a major power war. Lithuania is now a member of NATO. So if they want to play tough guy, and in fact they even said in the New York Times, well, we wouldn't be doing this if the Americans weren't backing us up, but hell, as long as the Americans are backing us up, we can say whatever we want. So Putin, go to hell. And it was the Americans who told the Lithuanians, you better open it back up and stop enforcing the sanctions. Let the Russians have their railway. It just shows that Pat Buchanan was right of what a quick flashpoint that could be for no good reason at all that we would do that. All right, then he continued to back the bad guys in Chechnya even after September 11th. Al-Qaeda is terrorists everywhere in the world, except in Chechnya, where they're still our guys, and until we get to Libya in 2011, but wait. Okay, and then he also tore up the anti-ballistic missile treaty. The anti-ballistic missile treaty says we can have 1 or 2 anti-missile sites, but that's it. Nixon signed it with the Reds back then. Because the deal is, if we build massive missile defensives, well, they'll just build more missiles, right? And vice versa. So the idea is, instead of permanent arms race brinksmanship, we just call a reasonable limit on the thing. Well, W. Bush tore up that treaty and announced he's building anti-missile stations in Romania and in Poland. These are countries where we promised not to move our military equipment in the Founding Act, but I guess we woke up one morning and changed our minds. And Bush says he's putting these anti-missile systems in there. Well, here's the thing about it. He said this is not for Russia because it's not enough missiles to shoot down an incoming salvo from the Russians anyway. He said this is for Iran, to prevent Iran from attacking Poland with missiles that can't reach Poland, with nukes that they've never made, with a range that their missiles don't possess, against a country that they have no grudge whatsoever. And when W. Bush first said this, everybody laughed. What the hell is he talking about? Protect Poland from Iran? It was funny because when Obama said it, everyone's like, yes, that's a very serious thing. But nobody could ever explain it. And Vladimir Putin said, well, I don't believe you because Iran isn't an enemy of Poland and I don't see the connection. I'll tell you what, why don't we put the anti-missile stations in the North Caucasus? And then that way, I'll give you a base in Ingushetia. And then that way you can shoot down what's ever coming out of Iran, right? No, we don't want to do that, Vladimir Putin, even though that would serve our pretended interests here. So what's the point? It's not enough anti-missile missiles to shoot down incoming nukes in Russian volumes. It ain't for Iran. Well, maybe it's because the launchers are dual-use launchers. The Mark 41 vertical missile launcher can hold Sparrow anti-missile missiles, but it can also hold Tomahawk cruise missiles that can be tipped with hydrogen bombs. So maybe George W. Bush and Barack Obama think they're smart, and what they're really doing is they're violating the spirit of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty that Ronald Reagan signed in '87 that keeps mid-range missiles, that kept mid-range nuclear missiles out of Europe. Major provocation, and one that the Russians brought up over and over again in the time after that. And W. Bush also, and you guys I hope have heard of these, okay? The color-coded revolutions. This was a major project of W. Bush. It started really under Bill Clinton in Slovakia, and then in Serbia in '98, and then in 2000. In 2000 it was called the Bulldozer Revolution in Serbia. It's how they overthrew Milosevic. But they did it again in Georgia in 2003. They overthrew Shevardnadze in favor of the American sock puppet Mikhail Saakashvili. And then they did it with the Orange Revolution in 2004 in Ukraine, where they prevented Yanukovych from taking power and made sure that the pro-Western guy, Yushchenko, was able to become president instead. They also, in 2005, overthrew the government in Kyrgyzstan in what was called the Tulip Revolution. And they tried, they tried and failed in '05 in the Denim Revolution in Belarus and the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon. And basically what this is, these are coups d'etats dressed up as popular revolutions. And the basic template is when you lose an election, George Soros comes and pays you to keep your people in the street and refuse to accept the results. And to claim, no, look, we have exit polls, and the exit polls are the real numbers that you're supposed to believe in, not the actual election results. And then they just keep the pressure on, and the Secretary of State's on the phone, and they end up forcing either a compromise or eventually a full-scale coup and overthrow the government. And they do this targeting especially friends of Russia. And, you know, if you think about Belarus, right there, north of Ukraine, this is the most important nation to Russia, more important than Ukraine. And the idea that the Americans would try to overthrow the government there and force a regime change there and put a pro-Western government there is literally psychopathically crazy, insane risk. The risk of major war with thermonuclear armed state over something that couldn't possibly be worth it. All right, so Obama comes in, and one of the worst things he does is Syria, but it's just too much to go into. But it was the worst kind of treason. You wouldn't believe it if I told you, so read the book. But in terms of Russia, the real worst thing that Obama did was he overthrew the government of Ukraine in 2014. And this is known as the Maidan Revolution, or the so-called Revolution of Dignity. And the Americans just poured in tens of millions of dollars to force this thing through. And on the street level, it was legitimate, you know, and I don't mean like everyone in America to the right of Bernie Sanders is a Nazi. I mean real Hitler-loving Nazis were the ones who did the putsch on the street, threatened to kill the president, and ran him right out of town. This led directly to the Ukrainians' loss of Crimea back to Russia, and then the outbreak of war in the East, when the people of the East demanded strong autonomy, and not really secession, but strong federalism and autonomy. And then the new national government went to war against them, launched what they called a war on terrorism against them. And the war, especially in 2014, was absolutely horrible. Something like 10,000 people were killed in the first year of war. And then in 2014, November 14, and then in February of 15, they passed what were called the Minsk deals, which sort of reduced the fighting. They didn't really end the war, but they reduced the fighting to what, you know, they call lower level fighting. And so another about 4,000 people were killed in the 8 years between the outbreak of war there and what they now call Russia's full-scale invasion, because they can't pretend that's when the war started in 22. The war started in 14, and it was Barack Obama who did it. And by the way, this is sort of a side point compared to Ukraine, but you guys are familiar with the hot mic moment when Barack Obama was backstage, but the microphone was still on and he was talking with Medvedev. And this is an example of Obama's treachery, because he was telling Medvedev, hey, don't worry, after I get reelected, then I can change the policy. So tell Vlad that. And Medvedev says, okay, I'll tell Vlad. Well, what were they talking about? Obama was telling him Once I'm reelected, I'll cancel the project of putting the anti-missile missiles in Romania and Poland. Tell Vlad, I just got to get reelected first and I'll turn that off. Well, that was a damned lie. He didn't do that. He continued on with that project through the rest of his presidency. All of that is still going to this day. And again, it's been cited repeatedly by the Russians ever since then as one of these major provocations that they're reacting against. Now, Trump comes in, famously he ran on saying, I want to get along with Russia. Wouldn't it be great if we could get along with Russia? And by the way, he won that election saying that. He said it over and over and over again. You might think the American people chose that policy. They elected the guy who said that was what his policy was going to be. Maybe the American people wanted to get along with Russia. Maybe that was his margin of victory. But no, what they do? They framed him for high treason. And they pretended to believe, the Democrats in league with the secret police, the FBI counterintelligence division, and the CIA, pretended to believe that Russia and Trump had conspired to do a coup d'etat and overthrow the election, and overthrow the government of the United States of America, and usurp Hillary Clinton's rightful throne. And they continued to pretend to believe this and have a special counsel investigation for 2 years and completely destroy his presidency. They talked about using the 25th Amendment to overthrow him. And when they decided that they knew they couldn't do it, his cabinet wouldn't go along, they told CNN, well, at least we can rein him in, prevent him from making peace with Russia. One anonymous Russia hand told the New York Times, see, Trump is like the captain of a ship. He's holding the wheel, but it's not attached to anything. The national security state will decide America's Russia policy, elections notwithstanding. And you guys are familiar with this from Ukraine Gate. Literally, for the 3rd time in American history, if you just got back from vacation, you wouldn't believe me. For the 3rd time in American history, a president was impeached. This time for temporarily holding up an arms deal to Ukraine. Okay? And what happened in that testimony, you watch that impeachment, and what was the phrase you hear over and over again? From Alexander Vindman, the lowly lieutenant colonel on the National Security Council, testifying under oath before Congress, what does he say? He says, the interagency has already decided America's Russia and Ukraine policy. And the president was trying to change it. Who the hell does he think he is? To come in here when we already have agreed. Well, what the hell is an interagency anyway? That's not even a thing, is it? That's a turn of phrase. It's not written in the law anywhere. What is the interagency? The interagency is the deputies committee meeting, right? You have the principals who are like the head of the departments on the cabinet. Then you have the deputies. So when the deputies committee meets, the lieutenant colonels have decided what our Russia and Ukraine policy is. And when the President of the United States says that he wants it to be different, well, we'll impeach him. How dare he? And seriously, go through and read that testimony, because they don't know that they're not supposed to be talking like this. This guy Vindman is not even born here. He's a Ukrainian American with a massive conflict of interest, who the CIA, John Brennan put on the National Security Council as a rat to find something to get Trump on in the first place, obviously. And this is what they get him on. He wanted to make nice with Russia. He wanted to work out a thing with Ukraine. We're not going to have that. So they clamped down on him. Now, that doesn't mean that he was a great president, because if he was, he would have figured out a way to stop him, and he didn't. He sure didn't. And either this was on his orders or despite his wishes, but the Pentagon did nothing but escalate for Trump's entire 4 years. What they do, and think about if the Russians were doing this to us all the time, and they're not. Well, this is what Trump's military was doing. They fly their nuclear bombers, their B-52s and other nuclear-capable bombers, right up to 12.5 miles off of the coast, which I guess is the 15-kilometer limit for international airspace over the water. We fly right up to the limit and force them to light up all their radars. This is just, and doing it over and over and over again in the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea, and I can never pronounce it right. the Ostok Sea in the Far East there near Vladivostok. Over and over and over again, they do this, essentially practicing a first strike nuclear attack on Russia. Over and over again, massive military exercises, naval exercises in the Black Sea, and combined force exercises with the Europeans. Joint exercises with Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Right within, there was one story from, I believe it was Estonia, where they're literally 200-300 yards from the Russian border. And we're doing these exercises. This is pure provocation. We're getting nothing out of this whatsoever except to drive the Russians completely crazy in doing this. Now, and then on his way out, what does he do? He tears up the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, Ronald Reagan's heroic achievement from 1987 that kept medium-range nuclear missiles out of Europe for 30 years. Tore that up. And he tore up the Open Skies Treaty, which was like Eisenhower's idea that we let unarmed military flights over each other's countries to check out each other's military bases. Well, that might sound a little espionage-y, but there's a good reason for it. It's so that both sides can reassure themselves that the other side is not mobilizing for nuclear war. What if there's bad rumors that the other side is mobilizing for war? Well, we had our Air Force fly over their country the day before yesterday, and those rumors are false. They're not mobilizing. Don't worry, National Security Council in whichever country. That was the purpose of it. But what did the Americans figure? The Americans figured we got all the satellites in the world. It's the Russians who need the overflights, not us. So screw them. Let's tear up the treaty. As though it's not in our interest to have the Russians calm and not afraid that perhaps we're mobilizing for war when we're not. Maybe we are. So there's terrible actions on Trump's part on the way out. And he had vowed that if he had been reelected and stayed, well, he claims to have been reelected, but if he had stayed, he had vowed to tear up the last major nuclear treaty that we have with the Russians, the New START Treaty, which is the only treaty that now limits the number of strategic nuclear weapons between America and Russia. So that is the single greatest silver lining to the election of Joe Biden, is that at least he saved the New START Treaty. Although, when he came in, Vladimir Putin said, hey, it was that nut Trump who tore up the INF Treaty and the Open Skies Treaty. Let's get back in those. And Biden said no. Trump was supposed to be some aberration, but Biden wasn't going to go back on his worst things. Then Biden comes in and he spends 2021 essentially massively escalating arms sales to Ukraine and repeatedly pledging in the form of different National Security Council, State Department, and Defense Department statements and, presentations and whatever, the integration, the de facto integration of Ukraine into the NATO military alliance. And, well, now that they're quiet, I sound really loud. And the war escalated in, I should say, like by October of 21. The war in the Donbass was getting much worse. And then by November, the Russians essentially said, that's enough. We want a new treaty. We want America to start living up to your former promises and to start backing down. Now, if you remember, the Democrats, and for that matter, the Republicans, but it's the Democrats in power now, the Democrats treated the Russians' proposed treaties of December 2021 as essentially preposterous. That, like, get this, guys. Vladimir Putin said something about some promise from 1997. What is he talking about? That might as well be 1897. You mean Bill Clinton promised not to move military equipment into the new NATO countries? Well, whatever. That's crazy. We're not doing that. And they literally used the word crazy. They treated that like it was some madness. I guess, Donald Trump got mad. Vladimir Putin got himself some mad cow disease. Got off on some crazy tangent where he thinks some word that Bill Clinton gave in 1997 ought to be of value, ought to hold value of any kind, ought to have meaning. of some kind. That's bananas. And they treat it like it was completely crazy. And now Biden did say, no, we can talk about, we promise not to put missiles in Ukraine. I mean, we won't put that in a treaty, but we'll tell you that. And look, we're not going to bring Ukraine into NATO like anytime soon. But no, we're not going to put that in a treaty either. We have an open door, and we can't let any other nation close the door on our open door for other nations to join our military alliance. They said that 1,000 times. You might think that there was actually a door somewhere, right? When instead, this is just some made-up term that they just made up. George W. Bush and his people made it up in 2008. There's no door. It's just a concept. And who cares if Russia absolutely throws a temper tantrum and says, we want you to close the door on this one nation and maybe the one north of it? I don't know. That really is supposed to be completely unreasonable, beyond, you know, the idea that we would entertain that at all was said to be nuts. And so the way that the Biden government treated the Russians' threats before the full-scale invasion was to say, you better not do it. But they refused to negotiate in good faith to do anything to try to prevent it in any real way. And then they made themselves very clear why not, and that was because they wanted to do what Lyndon Johnson had done to us, what Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, and Osama bin Laden had done to the Soviets, what Osama bin Laden and George Bush and Barack Obama and Donald Trump did to us in Afghanistan, and give them their own Vietnam again. And they said this over and over and over again, that this would be great if Russia invades, you know. We could fight them on the cheap. And in fact, the idea was that the Ukrainian army would be soundly defeated and we would be backing an insurgency, like Red Dawn, like Rambo 3. And we'd be backing an insurgency against them the whole time, this whole time. So the Ukrainians have done a lot better than that. And if you listen to all the Republicans and Democrats in the highest levels, they all agree with Lindsey Graham that this is the greatest thing. We're getting this bang for our buck. It's the cheapest thing. No American GIs are dying. Forget the Ukrainian conscripts. They're like not even worthy of mention. But Russians are being killed and Russian dollars are being wasted. And it's a strategic defeat for Russia, they say, and a strategic win for the United States. Literally, this is true. David Ignatius, who's thought to be the man at the Washington Post closest to the CIA, and that's really saying something, Ignatius wrote that this war is so good for the West. It's so good for us. It's so good for our allies. It's good for all of us. And then he literally used parentheses, except for the Ukrainians. Yeah, because they're dying by the tens of thousands. They've lost more guys in this war than we lost in Vietnam already. And they're worth nothing but a parentheses. We're sending Russian body bags home for nickels on the dollar. Bargain basement, flea market war, getting away with murder, and they brag about it. Now, they said before the war that we're pouring in all these weapons because we're carefully calibrating the amount of weapons to deter Russia from invading. So our choices are either they really suck at calibrating the amount of weapons that they put in there, and that they failed, and that instead of deterring Russia, they accidentally provoked the war. Or that's what they meant to do, provoke the war. Which is worse, I'm not sure. They're both at least absolutely horrible. And I'm out of time, so I'll try to do this extra fast here, because it's the same thing in the Far East with China. You know, Rex Tillerson, remember him? He was Donald Trump's first Secretary of State. He was the CEO of Exxon, which is the biggest and most powerful corporation on the planet, right? Standard Oil of New Jersey. They are the American empire, okay, since World War II. And Rex Tillerson gave an exit interview after leaving Trump's administration. He gave a talk to, or an interview with Bob Woodward, the famous Washington Post reporter who always interviews the principals at the highest levels, you know. And what Rex Tillerson told Bob Woodward was, he said, listen, what you have to understand is China threatens American domination of the Pacific. Right? He didn't say they threatened Catalina Island or, you know, even Baja, right? They threaten American domination of the Pacific Ocean. Is it a 100% American lake or only 95? And we won't settle for only 95. And this is the pretext. Again, the Wolfowitz doctrine. America must be the dominant force in all of the old world, even though that's not where we are. And what they do, it's the same kind of sophistry you get with Ukraine. We're pouring in all these weapons to the Taiwanese to deter a Chinese attack. And yet, look, you could absolutely hate the Chi-Coms and everything about their regime and their big stupid commie red flag and whatever. You can still just put yourself in their shoes. It's not hard to think the same way that Putin decided. Well, you keep arming up my enemy and arming him up and arming him up and arming him up. Maybe now is better than later. If it's now or never, and I'm gonna, you know, let you guys get away with this, or I'm gonna stop it before it's too late. So we know that the Chinese have built up a capable invasion force. We don't know if they're going to do it. They could do it tomorrow, or they might not at all. And they got $1 billion, you know, whatever, how many, or billions of dollars worth of trade between them. There's really no need for them to do this, other than if America really provokes it. And so we had this policy with Taiwan ever since Nixon and Kissinger went over there and shook hands with Mao 50 years ago. And the policy was essentially what they call strategic ambiguity. That we would tell the Chinese that, listen, it's one China, Taiwan belongs to China. However, we would really strongly prefer it if you guys reunify peacefully someday. And we don't want you to do anything violent. And then at the same time, they would tell the Taiwanese, and you pipe down, because I may or may not protect you if you get yourself in a fight. So don't you go doing anything stupid like declaring independence or being deliberately extra insulting to the Beijing government or anything that's going to get you into a fight, because I might not protect you. And that policy has helped to keep the peace for 50 years. But what happened was Barack Obama, and you understand, you know, the old saying, you keep your enemies closer. And the problem is then you got your enemies close. Well, Barack Obama made Hillary Clinton the Secretary of State. And so what did she do? She declared war on China. She wrote an article called Our Pacific Century for Foreign Policy, where she says it's time to pivot out of the Middle East, and it's time to start building up all our allies in Asia, because we've got to hem in the Chi-Coms. And this was, not that they really pivoted out of the Middle East, but they did start a massive buildup in East Asia. Donald Trump came in and only made it worse. And this was something where he agreed with his entire national security state. You know, the Navy and the Marines especially want to build up in the East. And Donald Trump was all for it. And on top of that, he added a terrible tariff regime. And libertarians, we got special insight into this that a lot of people don't seem to understand. You know, this guy Vivek Ramaswamy says we need a complete decoupling of America's economy and China's. Well, there's nothing more guaranteed to cause a war than that. That's the last thing in the world that we want. And there's plenty to detest about the Chinese government, okay? But having a nuclear war with them is the very worst thing that we could ever do. And there's no reason to ratchet up the tension or the danger of having a conflict with them. Or was essentially a renegade province. I mean, look at the American government's position in Ukraine. Is that Ukraine has the right to do anything to retake this renegade province. And Russia has no right whatsoever to help that renegade province preserve their independence from a completely illegitimate coup d'etat junta anyway that's attacking them. But in Taiwan, China has no right whatsoever to take back their renegade province, and we have every right in the world to play the role of Russia in backing the Taiwanese up in order to maintain their independence. It just goes to show there's no principle involved here. The liberal rules-based world order just means whatever serves American national interests as determined by a bunch of goons who, as you could tell, don't know America's national interests and couldn't tell if it hit them in the head. A bunch of Joe Bidens and John McCain's, and Bill Clinton's and George Bush's this whole time. It's all we've had since the end of the Cold War this whole time. And the rate they're going, they'll get us all killed, and for nothing special at all, for nothing worth it at all. So, in conclusion then,
Really?
Yeah. Listen to my interview of Lyle Goldstein from a few weeks ago. He's a real expert, formerly from the Naval War College. And they run these war games over and over and over and over again. If we fight China over Taiwan, we lose. We lose hundreds of planes. We lose dozens of ships. We lose thousands of sailors to the bottom of the Pacific. And we lose Taiwan anyway. Some of the times, it escalates to full-scale thermonuclear war. Other times, we quit while we're behind. So we either lose Taiwan and half our naval and air force, or we lose Taiwan and hang on to them. Those are our two choices when it comes down to it. And they've run those games over and over again, and that's our own Navy running those games when they don't cheat. They go, oh man, this doesn't look good. Okay, so here real quick. The Middle East, Russia, the Far East, sorry, I should have said Eastern Europe since I'm doing directions there. It's the same thing. It's the American policy of global domination, preeminence, hegemony, or whatever they call it, that's caused all these problems. It should not be a radical proposition or even a libertarian proposition that we should not be doing this. We shouldn't have been doing any of this. That at the very least, forget the post-World War II era, but just since the end of the Cold War, 30 years ago, we could have done like Jeane Kirkpatrick, who had been Ronald Reagan's ambassador to the UN. She was a legit neoconservative, a former leftist turned right-wing Reaganite hawk. But after the Cold War, she said, well, now we can be a normal country in a normal time. Get this. She said, we can eschew the burdens of superpower status and go back to just being a normal country, taking care of our own people, their rights, their safety, their liberty. Doesn't that sound right?
Yeah.
And after 30 years of all of this, does it seem really like the war parties got the case? That they're the ones who ought to still be in charge of deciding how to continue to proceed in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, in East Asia at all? I think this is where libertarians really have a comparative advantage, because none of this is our fault, right? So I think this is something where not only are we good on it, but we know the truth about it, and we can be honest about it in a way we're not compromised on the issue. We can be honest and we can lead other Americans. We can't make every American into a libertarian. We can make every American into an anti-war guy. And I've seen it. I mean, you guys have lived through it. You've seen it too. You've seen right-wing hawks, George Bush hawks, who now absolutely regret it and resent the lies, resent even their own previous positions on this, and wish they could take all that back. And I mean, hell, look at Twitter today on September 11th. You see legit right-wing thought leaders saying what a sin it was that our government exploited this tragedy in order to kill all these millions of people who had nothing to do with it and get all these soldiers killed. They lied to us, they wasted our money, they betrayed us. That's the consensus on the American right now. And so that can be the consensus for the entire American people, and that's really our job as libertarians to lead that. So we can do that. And we have to, because as Garrett Garrett said, we cannot have a limited government and a world empire. And he also said that the empire would kill our country too, as it's doing now. Yeah. So we can do like just like Ron Paul said, and just come home and call the whole thing off, and then everything will be fine. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'll take questions, and I got books at the back. Don't let me forget, I always forget to say that. I got books and I'm happy to sign them. Do we have another microphone so people can do questions? There is another mic. Is it working? You want to try it?
And I need someone to help me put books up.
I'm on it, Jim.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question with a hand up. He's really persistent.
Sure. You got that going?
We're waiting for the mic.
Let's check.
Oh, this table.
And maybe turn it down just a little, even lower, I think, maybe. Check, hold a little way. Check, check, check. Not too close.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
That's good.
May I for a sec?
Yes, ma'am.
Real quick, we also have special guests, surprise guests. I told you we have surprise guests. We have Whitney, whom I don't see now, the chair of the Libertarian Party of the state of Texas. And we have Dan Berman and his beautiful wife. Dan has a few things to also put on this table. So please come up, buy a book, buy whatever, chips, wine, etc. And you get them signed on the spot.
All right, very good. Okay, so you were first, sir? Or who's got the mic? Oh, you got the mic. Sorry. Good.
Scott, thanks so much for the presentation. Really
Sure.
enjoyed it. Can you speak about Zelensky? When he was elected in 2019, he actually ran and was soundly elected on making peace with Russia. So what explains him allowing his entire country to be destroyed?
Yeah. It's really a sad story, man. What happened was, if you go and look from September through the end of the year in 2019, he had signed a new deal that was named after the German foreign minister, Steinmeier. It was called the Steinmeier formula for how to implement Minsk II, so that we finally get a real ceasefire and an end of the war. But here's what happened. All the neo-Nazis came out. And I mean by the tens of thousands they came out. And they held these rallies called No to Capitulation. And they said explicitly, if Zelensky signs this deal, we'll kill him. And Andrei Beletsky, who was the founder of the Azov Battalion, from, get this, the Social National Party, he said, I can never remember the name of this street because it's hard to pronounce and memorize, but it's the main drag in Kiev. He said, if he signs this deal or tries to implement this deal, he'll be hanging from the neck on the main drag, Kershik Street or whatever it is there. Now, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post have all admitted, the New York Times 2 or 3 different times, they have said, hey, this is no idle threat. Right, some jerk in Alabama says he's going to hurt Joe Biden. Nobody cares. He's not getting anywhere near Joe Biden, and nobody thinks that he is. The FBI or the Secret Service or even his local sheriff is going to round him up, right? These guys threaten to put their hands on Zelensky, and the New York Times goes, and that's why Zelensky can't sign the deal. The Nazis will kill him. Well, what could prevent that? American help? Arresting the leaders of the Nazis, beefing up his internal security forces and keeping them at bay. This is supposedly this mature democracy we're fighting for here. But a bunch of Hitler-loving scum make a couple of threats and the president has to give in and the Americans don't help. The Americans are like, no, we agree with the Nazis. Don't implement the deal. And so that's the answer to your question. They threaten to kill him. Andrew Kramer in the New York Times will tell you, that's no idle threat.
Reinforcing what they're saying.
Yep. All right, and your sir.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for boiling down a half a century of war crimes and malfeasance into an hour.
Thanks.
But if you had to sort of boil it down further and come up with a pie chart of what's actually driving all of this, and you'd say one slice was maintaining the hegemony of the petrodollar. Another one is a sort of maintaining the military-industrial complex at all costs and damn whoever it kills. Is it panic and confidence in trying to save face, or is it something else?
Yeah, well, and don't forget the Israel lobby. I mean, they are so huge in this. You know, Norman Podhoretz and Irving Kristol both wrote back in the 70s that no matter what the issue is, if it's China or India or whatever, we just have to keep the Americans occupied overseas at all times. We cannot allow a reversion to inter-war isolationism. We have to keep the American empire available to protect Israel. So even if that means that the neocons got to lead the anti-China lobby, whatever, dude, as long as it's an excuse to keep a big Navy and a big Air Force, that's all they care about. And then look, always with these things, it's a massive conspiracy of interests. And, you know, obviously it's money and power. I don't think that you can overlook the national security institutions themselves. You know, my favorite journalist is Gareth Porter. And, you know, his take on the last Cold War and its origins was not that it's just the arms manufacturers. No, it was the admirals and the generals. They were the ones who wanted the Cold War with the Soviet Union. They were the ones who wanted to build up. They wanted that money for their little fiefdoms. They were the ones leading the parade, the joint staff. You know, they were the ones lying, pretending to believe the Soviets had hundreds of nuclear missiles and all of this crap when they knew they had 4, you know, building all of that up. So it's, you know, the services themselves, of course, the agencies, the CIA and all of the other, you know, so-called civilian intelligence agencies, and then, of course, the arms manufacturers. But at this point, you know, there's an author named Nick Turse, who's really the best American journalist on the terror wars in Africa. But he wrote a book called The Complex, because you can't call it the military-industrial complex anymore because you're leaving too much out, because it's the entire scientific complex, Silicon Valley and academia and medicine and media and everything. Ray McGovern calls it the Mickey Mat, which stands for like 6 things, whatever, complex. All these guys are on the dole. They were all getting paid. William Lynn said that the military budget is the biggest honeypot in the history of the world. There's nothing like it. And so if you can get close to it, look, even if you just make toothpaste or tube socks, you're crazy if you're not pursuing that Pentagon contract. That's where it's at, and your competition's got one. So like, you're just gonna seed the whole field. It's a huge part of the market for all kinds of things that you wouldn't even necessarily associate with militarism at all. So in that sense, it's just picture like the biggest, dirtiest damn snowball rolling downhill. You know, you got the Turkish lobby and the whoever else trying to weasel their way in there and get whatever they can. The foreign governments are a huge one. There's a great journalist named Ben Freeman who specializes in how much money the Saudis, the UAE, the Turks, the Israelis, the Brits, how much money they all spend lobbying our government for their national security needs. It's just, you know, the phrase was coined in Vietnam by the GIs, that the military is a self-licking ice cream cone. And that means that they're their own excuse for their own existence, and that they will make the next problem that they have to solve. And they'll just keep kicking the can down the road, keep kicking the consequences down, and following the consequences of the last thing they screwed up. But it always works for them. Just like in any government agency, as libertarians know, they fail upward, because what are you going to do? In fact, today's the anniversary, the 22nd anniversary of the towers fall. Thousands are killed. For people old enough who remember, you know, we thought that maybe 10,000 people had been killed or something. And then what happened? The government's approval rating went up to 90%, because we just got the one security force. We can't replace them. There's not... We didn't say no confidence in these guys. We're going to, what, bring back Bill? I don't know. Anything. Anything. Put Al Gore in there. Anything. Nope. This is our one group. This just happened on their watch. We have the highest confidence in them in any government ever, because it's good for them that they failed. You know, that's how it works. So that's the answer. It's all those things. If I had a pie chart, I really wouldn't know. It's like a Venn diagram. It's all just stacked on top of each other, one big circle, right?
One more question.
Okay.
Only one?
Well, I give long answers. It's not their fault.
How much would ending the Federal Reserve go towards trying to prevent the government from being able to finance all these wars?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think the answer is it would go a hell of a long way, and that to me is the #1 most important reason to oppose having a central bank at all. You know, Jonah Goldberg, the editor of the National Review, during Iraq War II, he said that, well, look, we have to have a central bank. What if there's a war? Yeah, see? That's right. That's why we want to take his central bank away, so that he can't have a war. He's the same guy that said he supports the Ladine Doctrine. The Ladine Doctrine says every 10 years or so, the Americans need to take some small, crappy little country and throw it up against the wall just to show the world we mean business. And we'll print money so that we don't have to raise your taxes, because if we raise your taxes, you won't vote for our guys next time. So that won't work. So we'll just print it. And of course, as people are finding out, it's always like this, but especially right now, everybody can feel it. Inflation is theft. Inflation is killing people right now. Inflation is the margin of, people's absolute failure and destitute. And I mean, drive around this town, any town in this state, there's people living under bridges everywhere because the rent went up and up and up and their wages just didn't. You know, you're supposed to get a raise every year because you've been doing a good job and you didn't quit. Here's your raise. Now you get a raise, it's not even enough to keep up with the cost of living, much less you're actually getting ahead because you've been putting in such good time at the company and whatever. And what are they doing with all that money? They're spending it killing people. You know, you pay income taxes your whole life. You pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in income tax. That's enough that the Ukrainian war machine wastes in a day, right? Your entire life of paying is as much as they just piss away without even thinking about it. Or worse, just paying the interest on a bond to some sovereign government overseas somewhere. This is where all your blood, sweat, and tears go because they needed that money for militarism. So yes, absolutely. You know, if you can't just abolish the Congress, at least abolish the central bank. All right? All right, thank you guys. Really appreciate it.